Operation Linebacker II was a U.S. 7th Air Force and U.S. Navy Task Force 77 aerial bombing campaign, conducted against targets in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam during the final period of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Unlike the Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker interdiction operations, Linebacker II would be a maximum-effort bombing campaign to destroy major target complexes in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas, which could only be accomplished by B-52s. It saw the largest heavy bomber strikes launched by the U.S. Air Force since the end of World War II. Linebacker II was a modified extension of the Operation Linebacker bombings conducted from May to October, with the emphasis of the new campaign shifted to attacks by B-52 Stratofortress heavy bombers rather than smaller tactical fighter aircraft. Background. Peace is at hand. On 8 October 1972, U.S. National Security Advisor Drive, Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc Tho met in Paris. They were there to discuss new proposals by both nations, hoping to reach mutually agreeable terms for a peace settlement for the decade-old Vietnam War. Tho presented a new North Vietnamese plan which included proposals for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American forces, and an exchange of prisoners of war. All three Vietnamese combatant governments, North Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, would remain intact, as would their separate armies. Hanoi no longer demanded that South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu be removed from office. The U.S. did not have to cease its aid to the Southern government, and both Washington and Hanoi could continue to resupply their allies or forces on a parity basis. No new North Vietnamese forces were to be infiltrated from the north, and the U.S. agreed to extend post-war reconstruction assistance to North Vietnam. The new terms on the table also included the establishment of a National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord, a loosely defined administrative structure which was to work toward general and local elections within South Vietnam. Political power would be shared by three groups: the Saigon government, the PRG, and a third force group to be mutually agreed upon by the other two parties. Since it was to work by consensus, nothing could be accomplished by the new council without the agreement of President Thieu. When the two sides convened again on the 17th of October, there were two main areas of disagreement: the periodic replacement of South Vietnam's American weaponry, and the release of political prisoners held by the Saigon government. The North Vietnamese had made significant modifications to their past negotiating position and were hurrying to get the agreement signed before November, believing that President Richard Nixon would be more willing to make concessions before, rather than after, the upcoming presidential election. Although there were still some issues to be finalized, Kissinger was generally satisfied with the new terms and so notified Nixon, who gave his approval to the settlement. The finalized agreement was to be signed in Hanoi on the 31st of October. Kissinger then flew on to Saigon on the 18th to discuss the terms with Thieu. The South Vietnamese president was not happy with either the new agreement or with Kissinger, who he felt had betrayed him. Although Kissinger knew Thieu's negotiating position, he had not informed him of the changes made in Paris, nor had his approval been sought. Kissinger had negotiated on behalf of the South Vietnamese government provisions that Thieu had already rejected. Thieu completely castigated the agreement and proposed 129 textual changes to the document. He went further, demanding that the demilitarized zone separating the two Vietnams be recognized as a true international border and not as a provisional military demarcation line, and that South Vietnam be recognized as a sovereign state. The supreme irony, in the words of Stanley Carnot, had now arrived. Having fought a war to defend South Vietnam's independence, The United States was now denying its legitimacy. Thieu then went one step further on the 26th of October, and publicly released an altered version of the text that made the South Vietnamese provisions look even worse than they actually were. The North Vietnamese leadership, believing that they had been hoodwinked by Kissinger, responded by broadcasting portions of the agreement that gave the impression that the agreement conformed to Washington and Saigon's objectives. Kissinger, hoping to both reassure the Communists of America's sincerity, and convince Thieu of the administration's dedication to a compromise, held a televised press conference at the White House during which he announced, "We believe that peace is at hand." On the 20th of November, the South Vietnamese revisions, and 44 additional changes demanded by Nixon, were presented to the North Vietnamese delegation by Kissinger. These new demands included that the DMZ be accepted as a true international boundary, that a token withdrawal of North Vietnamese troops take place, that the North Vietnamese guarantee an Indochina-wide ceasefire, and that a strong international peacekeeping force be created for supervising and enforcing the ceasefire. Once the North Vietnamese read the new demands, they began to retract their own concessions and wanted to bargain anew, leading Kissinger to proclaim that they were stalling. The talks, scheduled to last 10 days, ended on the 13th of December, with both parties agreeing to resume negotiations. Teams of experts from each side met to discuss technicalities and protocols on the 14th of December, during which time the North Vietnamese representatives submitted a Vietnamese language text of the protocol on prisoners containing several important changes that Hanoi had failed to gain in the main negotiating sessions. At a subsequent meeting of experts on the 16th of December, the North Vietnamese side stonewalled from beginning to end. The talks broke down that day, and the Hanoi negotiators refused to set a date for the resumption of negotiations. Prelude. Decisions. Nixon was now working against a January deadline. Kissinger's "peace is at hand" statement had raised expectations of a settlement among the U.S. population. Even weightier on the president's mind was the fact that the new 93rd Congress would go into session on the 3rd of January, and the president feared that the heavily Democratic legislative branch would preempt his pledge of peace with honor by legislating an end to the war. Also prompting the president toward some form of rapid offensive action was the cost of the force mobilization that had accompanied Operation Linebacker. The additional aircraft and personnel assigned to Southeast Asia for the operation was straining the Pentagon's budget. The cost of maintaining this augmentation force totaled over $4 billion by mid-autumn, and Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird insisted that the president request a supplementary defense appropriation from Congress to pay for it. Nixon and Kissinger were convinced that the legislative branch would seize the opportunity to simply write the United States out of the war. After returning from Paris on the 14th of December, and after consultations with Nixon, Kissinger fired off an ultimatum to Hanoi, threatening grave consequences if North Vietnam did not return to the negotiating table within 72 hours. On that day, Nixon ordered the reseeding of North Vietnamese ports with airdropped naval mines, and that the Joint Chiefs of Staff direct the Air Force to begin planning for a bombing campaign which was to begin within 72 hours. 2 days after the 16th of December deadline had passed, the U.S. bombed Hanoi. Senior Air Force officers James R. McCarthy and George B. Allison stated years later that the operation had been mainly politically driven, as a negotiation tool to bring the point home. Many historians of the Vietnam War follow the lead of President Nixon, who claimed that Hanoi's representatives had walked out of the talks, refusing to continue the negotiations. Both sides had proclaimed their willingness to continue the talks. However, Hanoi's negotiators refused to set a date, preferring to wait for the incoming Congress. The goal of President Nixon was not to convince Hanoi, but to convince Saigon. President Hu had to be convinced that, whatever the formal wording of the ceasefire agreement, he could count on Nixon to come to the defense of South Vietnam if the North broke the ceasefire. Planning in the wake of Operation Linebacker, the U.S. had a force of 207 B-52 bombers available for use in Southeast Asia. A total of 54 bombers were based at Utah Power TAFB, Thailand, while 153 were based at Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. This deployment, however, utilized nearly half of the Air Force's manned bomber fleet, and Strategic Air Command commanders were initially reluctant to risk their highly expensive aircraft and their highly trained crews in such an operation. In addition, the production line for B-52s had long since been shut down, and losses could not be replaced. The use of large numbers of B-52s was unprecedented in the war, and the proposed large-scale attacks on targets within 10 nautical miles of Hanoi represented a dynamic change in the employment of air resources. Many within SAC, however, welcomed the opportunity to fly into the heavily defended airspace of North Vietnam, hoping to finally prove the viability of manned bombers in a sophisticated Soviet-style air defense network of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery and MiG interceptors. One purely local reason for utilizing the B-52s instead of tactical aircraft for the planned campaign was the September through May monsoon weather within North Vietnam, which made visual bombing operations by tactical fighter bombers difficult. The B-52s were equipped with their own radar bomb navigation systems, and supporting fighter bombers would be able to strike targets with either newly deployed laser-guided bombs in clear weather or by utilizing LORAN and radar-guided bombing systems. The new operation, given the title Linebacker II, was marked by top-down planning by the SAC headquarters at AFB. Due to the restrictive timeframe imposed by President Nixon and the experience of Linebacker, SAC's plan called for all of the bombers to approach Hanoi at night in 3 distinct waves, each using identical approach paths and flying at the same altitude. The aircraft themselves were to fly in 3 plane formations known as cells, for more effective electronic warfare jamming coverage. Once the aircraft had dropped their bombs, they were to execute what SAC termed post-target turns to the west. These turns had 2 unfortunate consequences for the bombers. The B-52s would be turning into a strong headwind, slowing their ground speed by 100 knots and prolonging their stay in the target area, and the PTT would point the emitter antennas of their RU systems away from the radars they were attempting to jam, degrading the effectiveness of the cells, as well as showing the largest radar cross-section to the missile guidance radars. The aircraft employed, however, had significantly different capabilities. The B-52G carried fewer jammers and put out appreciably less power than the B-52Ds. However, they had more efficient engines and larger fuel tanks, hence they were assigned to longer-range mission routes. Because of these factors, the campaign would ultimately be conducted in 3 distinct phases as tactics and plans were altered in response to losses to SAMs.